Good afternoon. Hope all of you are doing well. Sorry for the schedule change. We're starting with a Mishnah in the middle of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, Maseches Kesubos Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. We'll be going to the Mishnah at an equal spot, approximately on Kaf Ches Amud Aleph. Let's get started. Ir shekavshua charkom. If there is a city that was overtaken by some type of soldiers, kol kohanos shenimsu b'socha psulos. We assume that all of the women who are found in that city who are kohanos, that they were violated and therefore they're psulos to their husband. V'im yesh lam edim. However, if there were edim to testify to the fact that they were not violated, then afilu eved ve'afilu shifcha, even if the eved is not an eved that we would normally accept for edus, but here it's an eved or a shifcha hare elu ne'eman, and we would trust them. Ve'ein ne'eman adam al yedei atzmo, and a person is not going to be trusted for themselves. So that means that the woman herself can't say, "I promise you, I was not violated." That does not work. The Gemara opens with a question, or minhu boleshes shabo le'ir. If there were soldiers that take over a city, so b'shas shalom, if they come into a city and they're really not there for war, they're there to live for a while. So then b'shas shalom and chavios psuchos asuros. If there's an open barrel of wine, we assume that the wine that they were menasech, the wine that they created yain nesech, but stumos mutaros. But if the barrels were closed, then we don't assume that that wine in the barrel is yain nesech. However, b'shas milchama, if the boleshes that comes to town is there and it's a wartime, then elu ve'elu mutaros levisha ein penai lenasech. Then even the open barrels, we're going to assume that there was no nisuch hayayin done with them because there's no time. They're in the middle of a battle. They're in the middle of a war. They're constantly eating on the run. They're taking care of their weapons, they're catching a nap, but they're not going to do avodah zarah with wine. So the Gemara is implying a question here. If that's true, then maybe we should assume that b'shas milchama, like in our Mishnah, that when the charkom come through the city, that a woman should not be psula. If they don't have time for the wine, why would they have time for the tashmish hamita? So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Mari, live al yesh pnai. Because of the yetzer hara, a person will make time to violate these women, but lenasech ein pnai. So therefore, there's no machlokas between our Mishnah and the Brisa here that's quoted in the Gemara at all. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Elazar mishmei dechizkiya amar kan becharkom shel osa malchus kan becharkom shel malchus acheres. He gives a different answer. He says, no, these two are not the same thing. One is people who are soldiers of their own city. People who are soldiers of their own city are not going to violate their own people who live in the city. So therefore, like this brisa, we're going to assume that b'shas milchama, that elu ve'elu mutaros. However, in our Mishnah, kan becharkom shel malchus acheres, that they will violate them. Says the Gemara, shel osa malchus nami. Even if it's going to be soldiers of one particular city, yefshar delo orak chad minayu. There has to be at least one soldier from the opposing team who's going to break into the city. Maybe we should assume that he was able to sneak into the city and he taka did violate someone. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, kishem mishmaros roos zo es zo. They had set up a system of guards surrounding the city such that each guard could see the guard to his right and to his left. And there was no way for someone to get in without everybody else knowing. That's a great system under the circumstances. Says the Gemara, yeah, that's a great circumstance. Last short line, Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. However, yefshar delo naima purta. Some people not off when they're soldiers. And I look around, security jobs hopefully are pretty boring. So they're standing there. Who says they didn't fall asleep and somebody snuck in? Says the Gemara, Amr Ablevi kigon de mahader le lemata shoshilta vekalba vegavza ve'avza. We're talking about a place where there are chains, where there are dogs, where there are ducks and birds that make a lot of sounds. And if someone were to walk through the gates, we would know. And therefore we can assume that nobody snuck in from the other army. Second of the wide lines, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zabda, Pligi bar Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya v'Rabbanan. These two drachim that the Gemara answered up, the stira from the Brisa that we brought in the beginning of this Gemara against our Mishnah, this actually is a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya, who was the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the Rabbanan. Chad Amar kan becharkom shel osa malchus, kan becharkom shel malchus acheres. One gave the answer, as we saw earlier, that there's a difference between our Mishnah, which was malchus acheres, versus the Brisa, which was the same city's malchus, the same city's soldiers. V'lo kasha le v'lo midi. There's no problem at all, no stira at all between the Brisa and the Mishnah. V'chad kasha le kolhani. The other asked all the questions that we just asked. Maybe the soldier snuck in, maybe the guards fell asleep. Umeshani kaven de mahadar lalamata shoshilta v'kalba v'gavza ve'avza. And we were able to answer up like we did before that there were chains, there were animals, it would have been noisy if somebody snuck in. So that's how the Gemara deals. This is the first sugya for today, how the Gemara deals with our Mishnah and the brisa that's brought in the beginning of the Gemara with these two drachim. And the Gemara initially presented them from Amoraim, but really it turns out that it was actually a machlokes tanoim between Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya and the Rabbanan. 5 lines into the wide lines, the Gemara moves on to a variation on the theme. Amar of Idi bar Avin Amar of Yitzchak bar Ashian. Im yesh sham machvoa achas. Let's say that in that city there's a space where one woman can hide, only one. So it says the Gemara that she is matzeles al hakohanos kulan. She saves all of the kohanos, and we don't assume that any of them are psula anymore. Asks the Gemara, if it can only hold one woman, I don't understand. What would be the halacha? That we can assume that any woman, any kohenes, could have been the one woman who was saved. Or perhaps maybe we don't say that. Says the Gemara, in order to try and answer this, the famed case of Shnei Shvilin, which is found throughout Shas in so many places. We've learned about it a number of times already. What's the case of Shnei Shvilin? Echad tamei ve'echad tahor. There's one pathway. Pathway A is tamei. There's definitely a dead body buried somewhere on pathway A. Pathway B is 100% tahor. Ve'halach be'echad mehen v'asa taharos. One person walked on one of the pathways. He doesn't know which one, and then he dealt with taharos. If he was tamei, it would have ruined the taharos. If he's tahor, the taharos would have been fine. And his friend walked in the other path. We don't know who walked on A and who walked on B, but we know that both pathways were walked upon, and we know that really one of them conceptually should be tamei meis. So that's a machlokes as to what we do. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im nishal ze bifnei atzmo v'ze bifnei atzmo tahoros. If each person asks on their own, because there's a possibility that they were not the one on the tamei pathway, therefore we can assume that person to be tahor. However, shneim ke'achas, if both Reuven and Shimon walk in together, one of them says, I don't know which one I walked on, I just know it was the different one than the other one, and vice versa, then he says Tameos. All of this is Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yossi argues. Rabbi Yossi, 5 lines from the bottom, Omer ben kachu ben kachtme, no matter what, they're going to be held tamei. Ve'omar Rava v'item Rav Yochanan, bevas achas, everyone agrees, if the shaila is asked, bevas achas divrei hakol tamei, and v'zeh achar zeh divrei hakol tahor, and if they ask in sequence, if they ask one after the other, then everyone's going to be tahor. Lo nechleku, where's the machlokas Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda? Lo nechleku ela beba lishal alav ve'al chavero. I'm coming here, I'm Reuven, I'm coming to ask about me and about Shimon. And under those circumstances, there's a machlokas. So fine. Says the Gemara, mar medami lo lebevas achas. According to one shita, when a person asks about himself and his friend, that's the same thing as bevas achas. It's as if you both showed up at the same time to ask a shaila, and therefore we have to be metame. That's the shita of Rabbi Yossi. Umar medami le bazeh acharze. And some say that no, that even though I'm asking the shaila about 2 people at once, but the case was where person 1 was on path A and person 2 was on path B. We just don't know who was where. The hachanami, maybe we can say in our case as well, we were asking, is there such a thing as this hiding place for one woman where she could be matzeles kohanos kulan? So says the Gemara, hachanami, maybe we should say, kevan deshari lekulhu ke bas achas dami. Maybe we can say that all of the women would be asura. Says the Gemara, you cannot compare our case of hiding one woman to the other case of Shnei Shvilin. Hachi hashta. There's no comparison between these 2 cases at all. Why not? Last 2 lines on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Because Hasam, in the case of the Shnei Shvilin, vadai ikatuma. There's no question in the case of Shnei Shvilin. Certainly one of the pathways is tamei. There's a big thing there that says, here lies person X. We know that there's a mace there. We just don't know who went on which path. So in the case of Shnei Shvilin, there's vadai tuma. But here in our case, says the Gemara, hacha miyemar deitme. We don't know for sure that any of the women were violated. It's a halachic assumption, yes, but we don't know for sure that anyone was violated. These cases are not comparable. Therefore, we can't extrapolate an answer from Shnei Shvilin back to our case. The Gemara asks another question. Boy Ravashi, Amra lo nichbesi, v'lo nitmesi mahu. That's a little bit of a throwback to the conversations about Pesha Asar Hu Pesha Hitir. So on the one hand, she said lo nichbesi. I definitely wasn't in hiding, Pesha Asar. And then she says v'lo nitmesi. But even though I wasn't hiding, I also wasn't nitmesi. I also didn't become tamei mahu. What is the din? So says the Gemara, Mi Amrinan, do we say, as we turn to the top of Chav Zayin Amud Beis, Mali l'shaker? I easily could have lied. Rashi says, Dibur Hamaskal Mali L'Shakir Iboya Amra Nichbesi. I could have said I hid. So therefore, because it's a migu, because I said that I was lo nichbesi, that I wasn't in hiding, therefore there's a lot of trustworthiness in that, because she put herself out on a limb to say that, and therefore we should trust her. Or do we not say Mali L'Shakir in such a case, and therefore we don't trust her, and she would be asura to her husband? Says the Gemara, maybe we can learn from the following. That a person lent an animal to his friend, or I should say his friend rented an animal from him. Omar le, here were the conditions of the loan. Lo tezel be'urcha de nahar pekod te ikamaya. You can borrow the donkey. Please don't take him down this road, down this pathway to Nahar Pekod, because there's a river over there and there's always too much water and it's dangerous for the animal. Zil, instead, go be'orcha de neresh to Lake Maya. I want you to take a different pathway. So you can rent my animal, but you have to follow my rules. You can only use pathway A to travel and not pathway B. Person takes it and doesn't listen to the rules. The renter takes the animal and he takes it be'orcha de Nahar Pekod. He takes him down the pathway where he shouldn't have, and the animal dies. Now, the animal doesn't die because of the concern of the maskir. The animal just died of natural causes, whatever the case is. He didn't die because of the water. So says the Gemara, he then brought his shaila, the borrower, the socher, I should say, brought the shaila to Rava. Asa lakame to Rava. Amar le. It's correct. I went down the wrong path. I went to the place where the maskir told me not to go. Mihu lo havamaya, but the animal didn't die because of water. There was no water that day. The animal died because of something else. So Amar Rava, Mali l'Shakir. The Gemara says he didn't have to say that he went to this pathway of Nahar Pekod. Maybe we should say that he's therefore telling the truth, that the animal died for other reasons. So says the Gemara, we trust that he's telling the truth, because he could have lied and said that he took the animal down a different path. I don't understand. Mali l'shaker b'makom edim lo amrinan. We don't say mali l'shaker. We don't employ the migu of mali l'shaker, that he could have said the person was in a different space, and now he says that he's in the wrong space. We trust him. We don't say that b'makom edim, in a place where there are edim. What does it mean b'makom edim? It means in a place where we have a halachic assumption that the water never stops, as was the case in Nahar Pekod. So says the Gemara, we're not allowed to say mali l'shaker in this case, and maybe the same exact thing should be true in our case as well. That if a woman says lo nichbesi, we have a halachic assumption, as our Mishnah stipulated, that she should have been violated, that she would have been violated. So therefore, maybe we can't say mali l'shaker. Says the Gemara, you cannot learn one thing from the other. We can't learn from the case of the donkey, where he told him not to go down to Nahar Pekod, and bring any information to extrapolate back to our case of a woman who said lo nichbesi. Why not? Hachi hashta, these cases are not comparable. Over there, in regards to the case of Nahar Pekod, where the maskir gave the socher directions, you can borrow my animal, but you can't go to Nahar Pekod, because really there's always water there. However, says the Gemara, you're right that we have an assumption that a woman was violated, but it doesn't mean that every woman was violated. It's a chashash that she was violated. It's not as strong as a chazaka as the fact that there was water at Nahar Pekod. Therefore, these cases are not comparable. It's only a chashash, and therefore we do say ubemakom chashasha amrinan. We do say the argument of mali l'shaker. Therefore, the question we started with in this piece of the sugya was: do we trust a woman to say lo nichbesi v'lo nitmesi? You're right, I wasn't in hiding, which would have left the assumption that she might have been violated. And then she said lo nitmesi, but I really wasn't violated. Do we believe her because of the argument of mali l'shaker? She could have lied and said she was in hiding. And we learn from the Gemara that because it's only a chashash of tuma, we allow her to employ the migu of mali l'shaker to say that she was not violated, and we trust her. That brings us to the two dots, a quarter of the way down on Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Let's continue. And we had said in our Mishnah that a woman is not ne'eman herself to say that she wasn't violated. However, we do trust witnesses, even though these witnesses are not ideal. It's a shifcha or it's an eved. Says the Gemara, it seems to be that even if this was her own maidservant, that she would be trustworthy. But how does that work? We have the following case scenario where a man gave a conditional get to his wife. The halacha is that when there's a conditional get in play, lo tisyach edimo ela al pi edim. They're not allowed to be alone. They can only be in closed quarters with edim. And the reason we don't allow that is if a man gives a conditional get to his wife and then they're intimate, the get becomes a get yashan, and the get yashan is no longer a valid get. So says the Gemara, in this case, they are allowed to give the get, no problem, but they can't be alone lest they decide that they end up being together. And says the Gemara, ve'afilu al pi eved ve'al pi shifcha chutz mi shifcha sa, with the exception of her own maidservant, mibnei sheliba gas b'shifcha sa, because she's very close to her shifcha. The Gemara makes an assumption that they're very close. She helps bathe her. She doesn't assume that she can't have tashmish amita with her husband, even with the shifcha in the room. So therefore, we don't seem to trust this shifcha when the shifcha is the maidservant of this woman. She's not trustworthy. But as the Gemara had opened a couple of lines ago, it was implied that even her own maidservant was trustworthy. So which one is it? Says the Gemara, Omar Rav Papi b'shvuya hekilu. We were lenient in our case to trust her maidservant, even though we don't trust her in the case of the get yashan. Rav Papa Amar ha b'shif chadida, ha b'shif chadidei. It depends. One case was shif chadida. That was the case of our Mishnah. And this case is shif chadidei, where it's his maidservant who is there. And then we don't assume that there would be tashmish amita under those circumstances. Says the Gemara, b'shif chadida lo mehemna. Is it in fact the case that we would not trust her maidservant? After all, haktani, what did we say in our Mishnah? Ein adam maid al atzmo hashif chadida mehemna. We do trust her. So which one is it? Do we trust her maidservant or do we not? Says the Gemara, really, shivchasa nami ke'atzma dami. We treat a woman's maidservant like we treat herself. And that is that if there were to have been yichud, let's say that the wife and the husband were alone, even though there was a get that was on the table and the shifcha was there, we assume that to still be yichud. We assume that to still be yichud. We have principles like this in halacha too, that we have a principle called libo gaspa, where the normal rules of yichud don't apply. Some of the meforshim, some of the poskim speak about this. If a person works in an office with a woman or someone of the opposite gender, so because they work together all the time, even though it's a halachically normal, appropriate relationship, but because libo gaspa, then there have to be more higher standards of hilchos yichud, more than the standard of the hilchos yichud that apply to a man and a woman who he doesn't know. So if you're in such a scenario, please make sure to ask shelas chacham. These are, of course, very important halachos that keep the appropriate boundaries in Klal Yisrael. Rav Ashi Amar, halfway down on Chav Zayin Amud Beis, Rav Ashi Amar, hava b'shif chadida. Really, both cases, the case of our Mishnah and the case of the get yashan, is speaking about shif chadida. We're talking about her maidservant. V'shivcha michsa chazia v'shaska. What we're concerned about is that the shifcha will see that she was intimate with her husband, and really the get is a get yashan, and she may not say anything in order to help the cause, even though halachically it's bad, but she may want to make sure that that her mistress, who she's servicing, that she is going to still be able to remarry. So it says the Gemara, hasam, in that case, dishtikasa matirta lo mehemna. In that case, because her silence would be the validation of the get. If she would have said they were together, then it would have been a get yashan. If she says nothing, and then the implication is that they were not together, then that's a matir that she'll marry someone again. That's a big problem, because then it's a get yashan, and then she's really not divorced from the first husband while she's married to a second one. They're lo mehemna. But hacha, in our case, dishtikasa osarta, here in our Mishnah, if she says nothing, then the assumption is that the woman's a psula. So there, it's different modalities of her being a maidservant. In the case of our Mishnah, her silence would be the bad evidence. It would indicate that she in fact was psula. The edus that we would need the shifcha to give is she wasn't nivelis. So therefore, there are different cases. Mehemna, says the Gemara, hashtanami asya mashakra. Maybe she'll lie in that case as well. Maybe she'll lie in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, tarte lo abda. A double lie she will not do. What does that mean? She won't withhold edus, and she won't give false edus. Kiho, we have a story that's similar to this, to Mari bar Isak, the Amri lachana bar Isak. We're not exactly sure who it was. We know that they were the children of Isak. And Asa le achami bechoza. He had a long-lost brother who showed up from another city, a brother that he had never met. Omar le, the brother showed up and said, Plogli benichse de Abba. You're my long-lost brother, and we need to split the inheritance of our father. Amarle lo yadana lach. I've never seen you before. I have no idea who you are. So they went to go ask a shaila. Asa lekamed Rav Chizda. Amar Le, Rav Chisda says back to him, he's actually right. He really is your long lost brother. Shapir ka Amar Lach. Tichsib, as we have a famed pasuk in the Torah about Yosef and his brothers. Vayaker Yosef esacha v'hem lo hikiru. That Yosef recognized his brothers. When Yosef left the house, all of his brothers were mature. They had beards already. Yosef was, he had no facial hair at all when he left the family. So says the Gemara, when Yosef left the house, he didn't have a beard. So the boys, the brothers, when they finally saw him as the viceroy of Egypt, they didn't recognize him. However, now that Yosef is here with a beard, they had no idea who he was. So says the Gemara, Omar Le, Zil Aisi Sade da Achvad. Rav Chisda says to the long lost brother, look, you came to town. We have a principle called Hamotzi Mechavero Olav Haraya. If you want to extract money from your brother, that's great, but you have to bring a raya that you're in fact his brother. So he says, Omar Le, Isli Sade, I do have witnesses, says the long lost brother, Umistefinu mine de Gavra Almahu, but they're very scared to give testimony because my brother is a Gavra Rabbi. He's a very strong person. Nobody wants to testify against him. So the Gemara responds, Omar Le, Rav Chisda then pivots to the brother, to the brother who was in town, not the brother who was long lost, but the brother who was here already. Omar Le, fine, Lididei, Zil, I seen who at the you have to bring a raya that he's not your brother, otherwise you have to pay. So he says back to him, that's not right. Omar Le Dina Hachi, that's not the halacha. The halacha is not, the burden's not on me. Hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. It's not fair that I should have to give a burden that he isn't my brother. He's trying to get money out of me. We have a constant themed principle in Shas of Hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, that if someone wants to extract money from me, that's great, but then bring a raya that you're my brother, and then I'll pay you. I don't have to bring a raya that you're not my brother. So says the Gemara. Rav Chisda responds, "You're right in general, but not here." Amar Le, hachi the inan alach ulekulu alme chavrach. Here, in this case, the din is like this because you're so powerful, and we don't want the edim to fear you to say that really you're brothers, because then it's going to force you to pay out. But still, says the Gemara, that's not a good argument. We're 5 lines before the Y lines. Hashtanami asu mishakre. But even if I bring Adam, he says, the Adam I'm going to bring are scared of me too. They're going to lie for my behalf. They're still going to lie. Says the Gemara, and this story is a riot to what we just extracted above. Tarte lo avde. People don't double lie. They don't both withhold edus, and they will not give false edus. The Gemara says, Lema ketanoi. Maybe this conversation really is a machlokes tanoim. How so? Zo edos ish ve'isha. This is the edus that is acceptable for a woman. We can accept them from a tinok v'tinokes, aviha ve'ima ve'acheha ve'achosa. All of these people are able to give positive testimony about a marriage. Aval lo beno ubita lo avda v'lo shivchasa. Yet on the other side, as much as that's true, anyone can give testimony that this woman is married, chutz mehemena ubayla, except for her herself and her husband. The two of them are no ge'badavar. Dirav papi udirav ashi tanoihi. According to Rav Papi and Rav Ashi from halfway down the page, according to the two of them, it does seem very much like these two brises are machlokes tanoim, and that's why Rav Ashi gave the answer earlier that it really depends what's going on. There's different types of edus, there's different types of shivchas. However, the Rav Papa, milema tanoi, we don't have to say that according to Rav Papa that it's a machlokes tanoim. Amar lach Rav Papa, kitanya hi b'mesicha lefituma. One brisa is speaking about mesiach lefituma. One brisa is speaking about another case. Ki hadachi asa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Chanan. Kartigna mishtai maisa ba lifnei Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Some people say that this story happened in front of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Va'amrei la Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi mishtai maisa ba lifnei Rabbi. And maybe the story happened with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and it was a story in front of Rabbi. Either way, be'adam shaheh mesiach lefi tumo. Be'adam echad shaheh mesiach lefi tumo. Be'amar ani v'imi nishpinu lebein ovdei kochavim. We were taken captive by the non-Jews. Yatzatzi lishov mayim. Every time I went out to drink water, I would look over my shoulder every 30 seconds. Daiti al imi, constantly looking. I see no one's with her. I see no one's near her, and she's totally fine. And he continues talking mesiach lefi tumo. He's speaking innocently, just to kind of in a very pure, and just telling a story. When I went out to go collect some firewood to keep the fire going, to keep us warm, daiti al imi. And what was the inference of this case? The mesiach levitumo vehisia Reb Kahuna al pi Rebbe. Excuse me, Rebbe allowed her to marry lekahuna to a kohen al piv because the son was watching, and the edus of mesiach lefitumo is a real edus, and therefore maybe Rav Papa doesn't view these two brises as a machlokes tanoim. This brings us to the next mission on the bottom of Chav Zayin Amud Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Zechariah ben Akatzav, Hamaon hazeh. This is a language of a shvua. He says, Lo zaza yadi mitoch yadi mishashen nichnasu avdei kochav Yerushalayim v'ad sheyatzu. Rav Zechariah said that his wife's hand was in his hand, either literal or figurative, meaning that she was not out of his sight for even a single moment. And he said, I know for sure that when they were there and then they left, they were not with my wife. And he was a Kohen. Amr lo, einodam meid al atzmo. Wow, that is a sharp retort. They're not even allowed to be married anymore. Says the Gemara, Tana ve'afal pike, and the Brisa writes, even though they're not allowed to be together anymore, yichei la bayis bechatzero. She's allowed to have a house in his on his property. When she would leave first, and then her sons. Then when she would come home, and her sons would be home first, of course, to avoid the isser of yichud. They're not allowed to be alone. So therefore, when she would leave, she'd always leave first. When she'd come home, she'd always come home second, so that she and her ex-husband would never be able to be home alone. Says the Gemara, we understand that this applies in this case where she was potentially violated, or at least the halachic assumption is that she was violated. How does this apply to a case of a regular gerusha? Are we allowed for a couple to be divorced and she can then live on campus? Can she live on the same property? So do we say, we were more lenient in the case of our Mishnah, which was a case where there was captivity, and therefore we were more lenient. Aval hachalo, but here in regards to a grusha, we're not going to be lenient. Odilma loshna, or perhaps the logic can still be employed and applied to the case of a grusha. And what would then be the case is that a grusha could live on the same property as her ex-husband. Says the Gemara, let's see if we can figure this out. Toshma. The Brisa writes to Tanya, Hamegaresh es ishto lo tinase bishchunaso. A woman who is divorced, she should not get married and live in the same neighborhood. V'im haya kohen, and says the Gemara, afilu lo nises. And if this man was a kohen, lo saduri mo b'mavui, they shouldn't even live in the same mavui. Says the Gemara, im haya kfar katan, if it was a very small city, zehayamai, so this actually took place. V'amru kfar katan nidon kishchuna, that a small village is treated like a shchuna. So these halachos apply under these circumstances. And then the Gemara says, mi nidcha mipnei mi, who needs to move out of the house? Okay, we understand now that the Kohen, that his wife was halachically assumed to have been violated, and mi nidcha mipnei mi, who has to move out in the unfortunate scenario. Says the Gemara, Toshma de Tanya, he nidches mipanav. She should move out. We'll see why shortly in the Gemara. Ve'ein hu nidche mipaneh, but he doesn't leave. V'im hayasa chatzer shela, if she owned the property, then hu nidche mipaneh, then he leaves. So it says the Gemara, I don't understand. What if they were both equal owners, or they both had one house each on the property? Tashma, we said that under equal circumstances, he nidches mipanav. She should leave. B'mayaskinan. What were we dealing with? Ilema b'chatzer shelo pshita. If it was his field, then we understand. B'chatzer shela. If it's her field, v'atanya im ha'isa chatzer shela hu nidche mipaneha. So which one is it? Says the Gemara, Elalav ki haygavna must be talking about a case where they both owned the property equally. So let's say that tenants buy the entirety, as we sometimes refer to it now with some of our mortgages. And what that means is that we each own a percentage of each percent, a part of each percentage. And therefore you can't sue me because I don't own any 1%. I own only a part of each percent. My wife owns the other part of each percent. So in that case, ki haygavna, that's when the woman would have to leave. Dilma to Agir Megar. Maybe we're only talking about a case of a rental and not a case of ownership. Says the Gemara, Mai have Allah. What would be the din? Tashma, Hine Hashem etal telecha. Let me just read this pasuk correctly. Hine Hashem etal telcha, tal tela. That the Gemara said tal tela gaver. V'amarav til tule de gavra kashan mideitza. It's harder for a man to travel by himself than it is for a woman to travel by herself. A woman's she has all the executive functioning skills. Again, we don't know exactly what the assumption is of the Gemara, but we're under some assumption that she'll do a better job of being on her own than he will. Tanu Rabbanan. The Brisa writes a third of the way down on Kavches Amud Beis, heading Kavches Amud Aleph, heading down to the Mishnah in another third of the page. Lo vehemena b'nichsei aviha. Let's say that he borrowed something from her that was initially her father's, meaning she borrowed something from her, really. Eino nifras ela al yedei acher. He's not allowed to even be alone with her to pay her back. There has to be an intermediary. Amarav Sheshes v'asu lekam ledina. If the two of them show up to Bezdin without an intermediary, lo mizdakekinan lehu, we don't even engage them. Get out of here. This is not the right way to do things. You need an intermediary. Rav Papa Amar shamuti mishamtinan lehu. They in fact are put into cherem. It's not sanua what they're doing. Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua took it even further. Amar negude nami minagdinan lehu. We give them lashes midrabanan. We give them lashes for behaving inappropriately. It's not sanua. Amar Rav Nachman, Tana be'evel Rabbasi. We learned in Evel Rabbasi. Says on the side here, it's going to be also, actually we quoted this a little bit earlier. Be'evel Rabbasi, what did we learn in that Gemara? That's only talking about a divorce. When do we have all of these guidelines? From a divorce after they were fully married. If the divorce took place only after Erusin, but they were never married and never together, then the payment can happen directly, even without an intermediary. There, she'ein libo gaspa, because they've never been intimate, so therefore, ein libo gaspa, the emotions aren't quite as developed and strong. There was a couple that had been engaged and they broke off their engagement and they went in front of Rava. Yasiv Rav Ada bar Masna Kame and Uki Rava Shlucha Ben Taihu. And Rava said, "This is not right. You guys need to have someone go between you." Amar le Rav Ada bar Masna, Amar Rav Nachman Tana be'evo Rabbasi v'chule. We just learned that only applies by married people, but not by people who are only engaged. Amar le, I know, but kochazina de kogaise bahadade. I can tell that they're still infatuated with one another, and therefore, if you can see that, then you need to mitigate. You need to take that into consideration. Therefore, Rava, for this particular couple, added for them that there should be someone between them. Ika de Amre, there are those who say, really, that wasn't what happened with Rava and this couple of the broken engagement. Really, lo oki Rava shliach bein tayu. He didn't put anyone between them. And normally Ravada bar Masna neku mar shlucha bein tayu. And the Talmud says to Rava, why don't you put someone between them? Amar Leva, Amar Rav Nachman Tanabevo Rabbasi v'chule. We already learned that it only applies. The intermediary is only necessary between the broken couple. It's only necessary when they were fully married. This couple was only engaged. The Talmud said back, Amar Le, Hani mili hecha delo gaise bahadade. That's only when they're not infatuated with one another. Aval hani kochazina lehu de gaise bahadade. But here we understand that where they are gaspa, where there is still strong emotions there, that we need to make sure that we're behaving appropriately and that we separate this couple just a little bit, because if we don't do that, we're afraid that something might end up happening and then they'll end up violating an Isser. This is just a very, very good and stark reminder that whenever we're in a scenario where we need to have the appropriate boundaries, we should certainly do so. We'll stop right here. In Yirtzeh Hashem, tomorrow night we'll pick up with Daf Kavches Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. Wishing you all a beautiful day.